Welcome to the XF Fully Loaded video tutorial. My name is Dave Polich, and I'll be your guide for this tutorial, which will explain how to load new sounds from sound libraries into your MOTIF XF. The MOTIF XF is the latest synthesizer workstation from Yamaha, continuing the line which began with the first MOTIF back in 2001. Like its predecessors, the MOTIF ES and XS, the MOTIF XF can load new sounds and samples. Unlike its predecessors, the MOTIF XF has an optional feature called a flashboard, which can be installed into the MOTIF XF and can hold samples which are stored in it permanently even after you power down the MOTIF. The MOTIF XF comes in the box with a standard 128 megabytes of user RAM, meaning that you can load new samples to it even if you do not have an optional flashboard installed. However, these samples will be lost upon powering down your MOTIF XF. Before we begin with a detailed explanation of how to load new sounds into your MOTIF XF, let's briefly discuss what we mean by voices and samples. Yamaha calls a MOTIF sound a voice. You play voices by first hitting the voice mode button on the XF and then choosing a voice from within the 8 preset voice banks or from the 4 user banks. You can clearly see which banks are which by looking at the rows of buttons on the right side of the MOTIF top panel next to the group of buttons which are labeled Mode. Look above each of these buttons that I pointed to. You'll see that there is a label in white lettering. The preset banks are labeled Preset 1, Preset 2, Preset 3, Preset 4, Preset 5, Preset 6, Preset 7, and Preset 8, or Pre-1 through Pre-8. The user banks are labeled User 1, User 2, User 3, and User 4. The remaining 4 buttons are labeled GM, GMDR, Pre-DR, and User DR. These stand for General MIDI Drum, Preset Drum, and User Drum. You'll also see that underneath each button, there are different names. These are instrument category names. For example, underneath the button labeled Pre-1, at the top of it, you'll see the word Piano. Right now, we're not going to explain what these category names underneath each button mean. We'll be concerned with the names at the top of each button. It's important to understand what is meant by Pre, User, GM, and DR. Pre means that the sounds in this bank are preset, meaning carved in stone. They cannot be erased or changed, and they will always be there. They are permanent. User means that the sounds in this bank can be changed or replaced by the user. That is you. GM stands for General MIDI, and this is where sounds for General MIDI are stored. They cannot be changed or erased, and they are permanent. You would use General MIDI sounds for playing back MIDI song files you download from the internet. GMDR means General MIDI Drum, and this is where the General MIDI drum sounds are. They are also permanent and cannot be changed. Pre-DR means preset drums. This is where all of the MOTIF's permanent drum kits are. If you change any of the drum kit sounds and want to store your changes, you have to store the changed drum kits to the user drum bank. Here, User DR means user drum. If you push the Performance button on the MOTIF XF, you can then access the performances, which are layers of 2 to 4 voices. Think of a voice as a book, and a performance is 2 to 4 books stacked on top of each other to make a more complex sound. Performances are located in the 4 user banks. They can be changed or overwritten by you, the user. They are not permanent. If it's confusing to you that both voices and performances can be in the user banks, just remember this. To hear voices, you push the voice button, then push any of the bank buttons, and then select a bank and number location to hear the voice. I'll push A and 1. And there's a piano sound. To hear and play performances, you push the performance button, and then push one of the user bank buttons and select a bank and number location of the performance to play. For instance, I've selected user bank 1, A1. This is a piano with rhythm performance. To stop the performance, just select another performance button. For example, if I want to play the main preset piano voice, I'll push the voice button, then the pre-1 button, and you can see that it and the A and 1 buttons all blink. It's waiting for you to make a selection. Within each preset or user bank, there are 8 smaller banks, each one labeled A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H. And inside each of those lettered smaller banks are 16 sounds, 1 through 16. So if I wanted to hear the voice in preset 1 and at A1, I would hit preset 1, then A, and then 1. It calls up that voice, and I can play it. Now, since I'm already in the A bank, if I want to hear the next voice within this A bank inside of the preset bank, I just hit the number 2, and it selects the next voice. If I want to hear the first performance, I push the performance button. Now you can see that the only buttons that light up are the user bank buttons and the small lettered and bank number buttons. There are 4 banks of performances in user bank 1, 2, 3, and 4. Within each user bank, 1 for example, you have 8 banks of 16 performances each. The 8 banks are labeled A through H, and then the performances individually are labeled 1 through 16. Let's say I want to go to user bank 3 and select performance B2. I push performance, then user 3, then B, and then 2. And now I have another performance selected. To recap what we just went over, Yamaha calls a sound a voice. The voices are located in preset banks, user banks, the GM and GM drum bank, and the preset drum and user drum bank. You access voices by pushing the voice button and then selecting your bank, followed by the sub bank and the number. Just to be clear, let's also review the meaning of the term user with regards to the MOTIF XF file system. Preset means you can't overwrite it. A preset can be edited, but then needs to be stored into a user location. Essentially, user means something that can be changed by you, the user. Confusingly, this word is used to describe banks where you can store sounds, sample memory space, and both sources and destinations. This simply is very confusing, and please don't feel like you're a klutz if it takes a while to get everything clear in your head. Once everything is clear, however, the XF will be a powerful weapon in your music production arsenal. User banks on the MOTIF XF. These are places where you can store new material, either sounds you create yourself or sounds you load in from a library. User RAM. This is memory that comes in a standard MOTIF XF. It is 128 megabytes in size and cannot be increased. The only way to get more memory is to install a flashboard, which we'll come to shortly. User RAM houses samples. If you have used a MOTIF XS, the XF's user RAM behaves just like the DIMM memory. You can write, overwrite, do what you want, but when you power down, it will go away. We advise you to treat the user RAM as a kind of temporary area into which you can load and audition sample libraries or individual sounds. When you're done auditioning, either save what you want to keep to a flashboard or to USB drive. Either way, samples stored in user RAM will be lost when you power down your MOTIF XF. The word user is also used within the context of loading from and saving to. Let's look again at this file screen on the MOTIF XF. When you're loading a voice library, the MOTIF XF needs to know where that data was when the library was created. The three options are User, FL1, and FL2. USR, which means user, refers to the user RAM area on the programmer's MOTIF XF. Now when we look at the fields to the right of the word USR, these are the destinations for where you want to store the data in your MOTIF XF. Let's go back to voice mode for a bit and look at how a voice is constructed. The MOTIF XF is a sample playback synthesizer. That means its sounds come from recordings which are split up into small single notes called samples. A group of these individual samples is linked together to form a sample waveform. A voice then consists of 8 elements. Each of these elements uses a waveform. There are hundreds and hundreds of waveforms in the memory of the MOTIF XF. Think of a waveform as a color in a paint box. You choose a color to make your picture, which is the element. You use controls in the element to adjust and shape the picture you make with your color, which is the waveform. The voice can have up to 8 elements or pictures going on at once. Let's look at an organ sound in the XF. Preset 1, F3, which is called 16 plus 8 plus 5 1/3. Press the Edit button. Then you see 4 element buttons light up. This means that the voice uses 4 elements or pictures. Now press the Track 1 button to access the first element. Press the second and third and fourth element buttons to turn them off, so we'll just hear the sound on this first element. Now, you can tell that it's an organ type kind of sound. Let's look at the main screen here. We are in the oscillator page. You can scroll down using the cursor buttons and see that the sample waveform for this is in the MOTIF's pre or preset category. It is an organ sound. OR means organ. It is waveform number 0358. And the name of the waveform is right below 0358, and it's called drawbar 16 or draw 16. You can hear from playing it that it is an organ waveform, but you can change the sample waveform to a different one. Let's choose a piano waveform by going up here and changing the category back to AP, which stands for acoustic piano, and then we have selected the first waveform in the acoustic piano group. Now we have a sound which is like a piano in tone, but with an organ shape. I changed the sample waveform. Sample waveforms are stored in 3 different kinds of memory places. They can be stored in pre, meaning preset. These are in permanent memory, or they can be stored from the user bank. At this time there's nothing in the user bank, or they can be selected from an optional flashboard installed, either FL1, which is flashboard 1, or FL2, which is flashboard 2. Sample waveforms stored to FL1 or FL2, in other words flashboards 1 or 2, don't go away when you power down your XF. They are permanent until you delete them from the flashboard or replace them. To select the area of memory your sample waveform is in, again, you scroll to and highlight the field next to the words Wave Bank in the oscillator edit page, which is what we're looking at now. I'm not explaining this to you because there will be a pop quiz about how to change and adjust voices in the MOTIF XF. I'm explaining to you to understand that voices use sample waveforms, and those sample waveforms can be stored to different memory areas in your MOTIF XF. The biggest misconception people have about the MOTIF XF is that you store voices to the user RAM or the flashboard. You don't store voices to either the user RAM memory or an installed flashboard. you are only storing the samples. In other words, these waveforms, which pop up when you select them on the screen. Voices or performances can only be stored to the user banks 1 through 4. You have 4 banks, each with 128 slots, for a total of 512 voices or 512 performances. That's all the slots you have open to you. The MOTIF XF is an extension of and an update of the MOTIF XS and has added a lot of new features, including new sounds. The additional sounds that come with it are located in the user banks. That's because they wanted to maintain compatibility with existing MOTIF XS sounds and libraries, and so they kept the preset banks arranged in the same place as they were on the XS. On the XS, we had 3 user banks. In the MOTIF XF, as you can see, we have 4. The new voices that come in the MOTIF when you first open it up and take it out of the box are located in user 1. The new performances, which draw on the voices which are new, are also located in the user bank, in user 1. If you load new sounds from the MOTIF sound libraries available at the motivator.com shop, you can easily overwrite the new XF factory sounds in user bank 1. This is a source of frustration for XF owners who purchase a new sound library, then load it, and wonder where the sounds in the user 1 bank went. And this is really the primary reason for this tutorial, to explain how to save those user bank 1 sounds and then how to load new sounds. Let's review what we just went over in this section. The sounds in the XF come from recordings, which are split up into single notes called samples. And samples are linked together to form a sample waveform. The sample waveform is placed inside an element in a voice. There are 8 available elements in a voice. Not all of them have to be used. You can change the sound of an element by changing the waveform it uses. Waveforms are stored in 3 places in the XF memory. The preset, where the permanent factory samples are, the user memory, which is also called RAM and can be thought of as a temporary testing area for samples, and Flashboard 1 or Flashboard 2, also known as FL1 and FL2. These are separate circuit boards you buy and install in the MOTIF XF. Samples stored to these flashboards stay permanently unless you delete or overwrite them. Recapping further, voices are like pictures, and the samples are like colors used to paint the pictures. There are 512 slots in the user banks where you can put your voices, or pictures if you will, and 3 different areas of memory where the samples or colors for the pictures are: preset, user, and flash. The MOTIF XF comes with new sounds stored in user bank 1. It is easy to erase these sounds and lose them, so we are going to explain how to avoid that in the next section. Before you load anything new into your MOTIF XF, it's a great idea to save what's already in there and store it someplace for safekeeping. Let's look at 2 scenarios. The first one will be where you haven't done anything with the XF except play with the included sounds and you haven't adjusted anything. The second scenario will be where you have done a little bit of fiddling with the sounds or made some songs or patterns and you want to keep those. First scenario, saving the factory set. The voices, performances, demo songs, and master settings that are included in your XF are what we call the factory set. Assuming you didn't make any changes to it and just played around with the sounds, you can save it to a USB drive so you can pull individual voices and performances from it later if you want. So, to do this, insert your USB drive in the slot on the back of the MOTIF XF labeled To Device. Press the Voice button. Press the File button. Make sure that your file type is set to All. This means you will be saving all of what is in the MOTIF XF. Press SF1, which is the button for Save. You'll see a character display come up. Press F6, which clears it. Then enter a new name for the file you are about to save. Use the cursor left, right, or up-down buttons to select characters. Then use the Insert button, F4, to input the character. You can see as I do this that I'm going to call this factory. Each time that I'm selecting a character, I then have to press F4 to insert it. When done with your name, press Enter. The screen asks if you are sure. You press the Yes button. You'll see the message, Now Saving, in the display. When the save operation is finished, you'll see the name of your file in the list of files. Here it is, factory.n3.x3a. I'll explain what .n3 and x3a mean in a moment. What if you want to get back all the factory set sounds again before you save anything? In other words, you want to restore the motif to the condition it was in when you first took it out of the box. It's easy. Let's press voice mode first to escape the file screen. Now let's press Utility, then Job, then Enter, then Yes. You will see a message on the screen that says Now Executing Factory Set. Wait for it to finish. When it is completed, it will say Completed, and then you will be returned to the file screen. Second scenario. You have made new sound adjustments, songs or patterns, and need to keep those. Let's say you know something about changing sounds in the XF, and you've done that, maybe made some songs on it too. Now you need to save your data before you load a new sound library. To do that, we basically follow the same procedure of saving that I explained before. Insert your USB drive, press the voice button, press the file button. On the screen, make sure that the type is set to all. That means you will be saving all of what is in the MOTIF XF. If you have some samples loaded to your flashboard, and it is in flashboard SOT1, and you want to save them, you will want to navigate to the Save FL1 field and change it to With Sample. If you have samples in slots 2, where your flashboard 2 is located, and you want to save those samples, you change these to With Sample as well. If you do not have any samples that you want to save, just leave these set to where they default to, which is Without Sample. Now, press SF1. You will be greeted with the naming screen. Press F6 to clear it. And you can call it a name that you want. I'm going to call this My Data. Remember, use the cursor buttons or the jog wheel to locate characters that you want to insert in the display. And then when you want to insert them, press F4, which is below Insert. When you're done with your name and you're happy with it, press Enter and then Yes. And it will save onto your USB stick. When it's done, you'll see Completed in the screen, and you'll be returned to the file screen. And you can see that there is the data file, mydata.n3.x3a. The suffix .n3 means the file was saved with no samples in either flashboard 1 or flashboard 2. .x3a means that this is an XF all type formatted file. Let's recap what we just went over. Before you load anything new to the XF, make sure to save what's already in it. If you haven't made anything new in the XF or changed anything, save the existing factory sounds by pressing File, then Set Type to All, press SF1 button, which is Save, name your file to something like Factory, hit Enter, and then Yes. If you have flashboards installed in your XF and loaded some new sounds and samples and maybe some songs, press File, then Set Type to All, set Save FL1 and FL2 to With Sample if there are samples in it, in either of the flashboards, press SF1, enter a new name with your file, like My Data or whatever you want to call it, hit Enter, and then hit Yes. and the file will be saved to your USB stick. If you don't have a flash board, you press File, then set Type to All, and make sure that Save FL1 and FL2 are set to Without Sample. Create a name for your file by calling it something that you like My Data, then press Enter, and then press Yes. Alright, we're going to load a new sound library into the MOTIF XF. We'll start with one of the sound libraries available at the Motivator.com shop, Vintage Keys, which is a collection of vintage keyboard and synthesizer sounds. Vintage Keys is what we call a programmed library, meaning it doesn't bring in new samples with it when it is loaded. It uses the XF factory sample waveforms, which are stored in permanent memory in the XF. Start by putting the Vintage Keys ALL file on your USB drive. Then place the USB drive in the to-device slot on the back of the MOTIF XF. Press Voice, then press File. Make sure Type is set to All. Scroll up with the cursor button and then scroll down to highlight the name of the library that you're going to load. In this case, it's at the bottom of the list here, and there it is, Vintage Keys. .n3.x3a. Hit the right cursor button once to move down to these fields. Make sure that the field next to Load User is set to User. The reason we're doing this, again, is because Vintage Keys doesn't have any samples, so we don't need to load any samples to the flashboard. We'll be fine doing it just like this. Cursor back up to make sure that the library's name is highlighted again. Hit SF2 Load, and then Yes. And the library will load rather quickly. When the file is finished loading, you'll be returned to the file screen after seeing the word completed on the screen. You press Voice to escape the file mode. And in the case of Vintage Keys, which is designed to load to User Bank 4, you now press User 4. You'll see these three buttons light up and flash. And you press A, which is the first bank of 8 within the User 4 bank, and then 1. And that selects the first Vintage Keys voice, which is a Rhodes sound. Let's recap. Loading a sound library that does not use new samples. Put the library file on a USB stick, insert it into your to-device slot on the back of the XF. The screen will say USB device connecting. Press Voice, then File. Set Type to All. Highlight the name of the library you are loading. Navigate to the field next to Load User and make sure that it is set to User because you're not loading any new samples. Then press SF2 Load, Enter, and Yes. The library will load, and in the case of this particular library, it will load to User 4, and you can start with A and 1 from User 4 to start playing and hearing the sounds. Consult the owner's manual for the library you downloaded to see exactly which user bank the sounds will be loaded to. Now let's review loading a new sound library that uses new samples, like the DC Productions library Air XF. In this case, some of the voices in this library use new samples not found in the XF's permanent sample memory. These will be user samples, and we have to tell the XF where we want those samples to go. First, let's assume you bought a flashboard or two, and you have followed the procedure for installing them correctly and have formatted them. Instructions for installing flashboards are in your MOTIF XF Owner's Manual, and instructions for formatting are available in the MOTIF XF section of the Motivator.com website. Okay, flashboards are in. Start by putting Air XF onto your USB drive. Put it in the USB 2 device slot on the back of the MOTIF XF. Wait for the USB device to be recognized. Then press Voice, followed by File. Make sure that the type is set to All. Scroll up and then down to highlight the name of the library we're going to load. In this case again, airxf.n3.x3a. We have here a list of sources on the right side of the screen. Load User, and underneath that, FL1 and FL2. These are the three possible places within this library where data could be. You can load from whatever was in the user bank, represented by the word USR in white letters, or whatever was in the flashboards, FL1 or FL2. Next to each of these sources is a field indicating the destination where you want the data to go. For example, if you want to load the data that was saved in the user RAM area in this library, you select the field next to User, and you now have a choice of destinations where you want to load to. User, USR, or the user RAM, or the temporary area. FL1, which is Flashboard 1, or FL2, which is Flashboard 2. If you do not have any flashboards installed, you will still see FL1 and FL2 in the destination options. If you choose either FL1 or FL2 and you do not have a flashboard installed, the data will not be loaded anywhere and you will get an error message. Now if you move down to the source marked FL1 in white letters, you will have additional choices to make. You can load to User, which is the user RAM, FL1, which is Flashboard 1, FL1 without sample, meaning that no samples will be loaded to FL1, FL2, meaning Flashboard 2, FL2 without sample, meaning no samples will be loaded to Flashboard 2, and none, meaning you won't be loading anything to a flashboard. If you choose FL2 as the source in this library that you will be loading from, the destination choices are the same as they are for FL1. You can load to User, FL1, which is Flashboard 1, FL1 without sample, meaning that no samples will be loaded, FL2, meaning Flashboard 2, FL2 without samples, meaning no samples will be loaded to Flashboard 2, and none, meaning you won't be loading anything to the flashboard. How would you know how the library's data was originally saved? You look at the suffix after the name in the library, listed in your file window. If you see the name followed by .n1, that means there were no samples saved to a flashboard located in slot 1. If you see .n2 in the name, that means that there were no samples saved to a flashboard in slot 2. If you see a .n3 in the name, as it is here, it means nothing was saved to flashboards in either slot 1 or slot 2. That data would have been saved to the temporary user RAM, or there would have been no samples included in the saved library. So if someone had a flashboard in slot 1 and saved this library with its samples onto USB, you would see that the name has the .n2 in it, meaning nothing in the Flashboard 2 or FL2 slot. Most large-size sample-based libraries available at the shop at motivator.com will have the .n2 in their name because these libraries were saved with samples meant to be loaded back to a flashboard located in slot 1 or FL1. For this example, I'm going to load air.n3.x3a and I am going to load its samples to Flashboard 1. Make sure that the library's name is highlighted. Make sure type is set to all. The source next to load user is destination FL1. Below that, I make sure that the fields read FL1 and FL2 respectively. Using the cursor buttons, I then navigate back up to and highlight the name of the library. I press SF2 load, followed by yes. At first you see the now loading message in the screen, followed by now installing to the flash expansion memory module. The screen will stay on this message for a while because the samples that belong to the Air XF library are being burned onto the flashboard. During this time, don't turn off your MOTIF. Don't do anything. Don't press any button. Even if it seems like it is taking too long or it is stuck, trust me, be patient and wait. The process will eventually finish. You'll see now loading, again for a brief moment on the screen, then you will see completed, and you'll be returned to the file screen. Exit by pressing Voice, then press User 4, A, and 1 to begin playing the samples and the voices in this library. Here's the cool part. The MOTIF ES, and MOTIF XF did not have a flashboard memory option. So if you loaded a sound library that used new samples, these had to be loaded to optional DIMM memory modules installed. And furthermore, when you powered down the MOTIF ES or XS, those samples were lost. So you'd have to remember to reload your new samples every time you turned on the synthesizer. Reviewing what we did, which was load a sound library that has new samples in it that you want stored on your flashboard. Make sure that the file is on your USB stick, press Voice, press File, make sure that the type is set to All, navigate up and highlight the name of the library that you want to load, navigate back down and make sure that next to the word Load User, you have your destination sent, which is either FL1 or Flashboard 1, or FL2, which is Flashboard 2. Make sure once again that the correct library name is highlighted. Press SF2 Load. You'll see Now Loading, followed by Now Installing to the Flash Expansion Memory Module. It will take some time. Don't do anything. Then you will see Now Loading, followed by Completed. Press Voice, then the bank, in this case User Bank 4 or User 4, then A and 1 to begin playing. If you store the samples that a library uses to a flashboard on the MOTIF XF, the samples are retained even when the XF is turned off, meaning that when you turn it back on again, you don't have to load them again. This is a huge time saver, to say the least. The samples will stay on the flashboard until you either delete them or somehow overwrite them. How would you overwrite the samples on a flashboard? Well, while the flashboard has a lot of memory available, it has a limit as to the amount of data it can hold. It can hold a certain number of waveforms, or a certain number of samples, and a certain size amount in megabytes of sample data. If you exceed any of these limits by loading too many sound libraries into your flashboard, you will start overwriting some of the samples. So, if you begin to suspect that you have overwritten some samples, and things that are loaded just sound plain wrong, you can start over by deleting samples from the flashboard. You do this by pressing Utility, then F6. Make sure that you are looking at the proper flashboard. In this case, we have one in FL1, and it is formatted. Below that, you will see SF1, which is delete one of the samples, or SF2, which is delete all. My advice when in doubt is to delete all by selecting SF2. This clears your flashboard of all the samples you have stored, and once it's done, you have a clean slate and you can start over. Deleting all takes some time. A really long time if you have a flashboard that is completely filled up. Be patient and wait for the process to finish. When it does, you will see that there are no sample waveforms in the window list anymore. If you already had samples in your flashboard and you load a new library with samples, and now you're confused about where the samples have gone or if things sound wrong, often the best thing to do is erase the samples on your flashboard and start over. First press Utility, then F6, which is Flash. Look at the top of the screen to make sure that the right flashboard is selected, in this case FL1, then select SF2, which is delete all, and wait a long time for the samples to be deleted from your flashboard. You'll finally see the window with no samples listed. It's a good idea to do one more thing. Restore the XF back to its original factory condition by pressing Utility, then Job, then Enter, and then Yes. Wait for it to say completed on the screen, then you can begin again with loading sounds as we have explained. Before going further, let's qualify what types of sound libraries can be loaded only to the flashboard and not to the user RAM on a stock MOTIF XF. You must load a library to a flashboard if it has the following characteristics. It is larger in size than 128 megabytes or contains more than 128 waveforms. The manual that was included with your sound library should explain whether the library must be loaded to a flashboard or if it can be loaded to the user RAM on a MOTIF XF with no flashboard installed. How will you know if there are more than 128 waveforms in a sound library? Easy. If you choose to load it to user and not FL1 or FL2, you will get a message saying sample memory full on your screen. The XF is smart enough to stop you from trying to load more waveforms than your user RAM can hold. Let's demonstrate this by trying to load an XS format library, MoSchool 2 version 2, to the XF. The XF can in theory load any MOTIF ES or XS formatted library. But watch what happens with this particular library. I select the file called MoSchool2 v2.xoa, which is an XS formatted library. The mode is set to voice, file is set to all, load user is set to user, and below that the fields are set to FL1 and FL2 respectively. The library is under 112 megabytes in size, so in theory it should load to the user RAM, which is 128 megabytes, right? Let's see. I'll press load SF2, and yes. Oops, I get the error message waveform full. What is going on? MoSchool 2 version 2, which was an XS format library, contains 192 waveforms. The waveform limit for user RAM on the XF is 128. Therefore, you cannot load MoSchool 2 version 2 to a standard MOTIF XF with no flashboard installed. There are too many waveforms to load. You must load it to an XF with a flashboard. Let's review. A sound library must be loaded to a flashboard if it is larger than 128 megabytes or has more than 128 waveforms in it. You will know if you must load it to a flashboard and not the temporary user RAM area when you select the library, set its destination to user, press SF2 load, and see a sample memory full or waveform full message on the screen. Now let's move on to a new scenario. Say you've loaded a library that uses new samples, and its samples have been stored to a flashboard. The library is in user bank 4. Now you want to load another library, loading its samples to the flashboard as well, but the next library is formatted to load its users to user bank 4 as well. How do you change things so that your next library will load to user bank 3 instead of 4? Let's take a look. Here we have Boulder Sound's excellent library, Granular Voices XF loaded. Its samples are in flashboard 1, and its voices are in user bank 4. Now we want to load the Gospel Musicians library, Neo Soul Rhodes XF, so that the samples that belong to it also go to the flashboard, but its voices go to user bank 3. I want, in other words, to have both libraries loaded. How do I do this? Remember, Granular Voices XF is already loaded, and its samples are in flashboard 1 or FL1. Making sure that the Neo Soul Rhodes library is on the USB drive, I press Voice, then File. I locate the Neo Soul Rhodes voice from the list. There it is, neosoulrhodes.n3.x3a. I scroll down to the type field and set that to one bank voice. I scroll back up to highlight the Neo Soul Rhodes library name, and I press Enter. You will see User 1, User 2, User 3, User 4, and UDR in the window. Scroll down to highlight User 4. This is where the Neo Soul Rhodes voices are originally located, the source in other words. Now press the right cursor button once and navigate down to set the bank to which you will load the voices. I'm going to set it to User 3. This is where I will be sending the Neo Soul Rhodes voices to, in other words, the target. Now press the right cursor button once, and then the up cursor button once. Highlight the field next to Load User. Make sure to set to FL1. Now press the SF2 Load button and followed by the Yes button. Once again, you'll see Now Loading on the screen, followed by Now Installing to the Flash Expansion Memory Module. This will take a long while to finish. Don't do anything, don't touch anything. Wait for the process of burning the Neo Soul Rhodes samples to the flashboard to finish. You'll eventually see Now Loading, again, followed by Completed. And then you'll see the file screen again. Press the Voice button, then press User 3, A, and 1. Here is the first Neo Soul Rhodes voice. Now press User 4 and A and 1. Here is the first Granular Voices XF voice. You now have 2 libraries loaded with all of their samples in your flashboard. You can continue loading another 2 libraries this way, each time changing the target user bank to the next bank you want to fill up. For example, if you next want to load a library to User Bank 2 and thus have voice libraries in User Bank 2, 3, and 4, follow the instructions I gave for loading the Neo Soul Rhodes library, but instead of making the target bank User 3, you would make it User 2. Let's recap. Loading more than one library to a flashboard. Assuming you've loaded a library with samples successfully, and the voices in that library are in User Bank 4, you want to load a new library, but make its voices go to User Bank 3. You press Voice, then set type to One Bank Voice. Scroll back up and highlight the name of the library. Press Enter. Select the source within that library from which you will be taking the voices, in this case User Bank 4. Scroll down, change the target bank to User 3, and make sure that next to Load User you have set it to the flashboard, in this case FL1. Press Load, and Enter, and Yes. Now if you want to load yet another library, follow these instructions, but change the destination field to User 2 or User 1. Very big disclaimer. At some point, you will likely run out of voice slots to load sounds to once you have filled up the 4 user banks. You cannot continue to load sounds in without erasing what is already loaded. Let's say you have purchased more than 4 sound libraries and you would like access to the sounds from all those libraries. How do you address the fact that you only have 4 user banks available? The answer is you compile your own custom user banks that contain voices from your favorite libraries. You could have custom user banks of your favorite drum sounds, favorite piano sounds, favorite drum loops, favorite synthesizer sounds, favorite orchestral sounds, and so on. The way that you compile custom banks is to load in single voices, and I'm going to explain exactly how to do that next. Now let's explore how to load a single voice from a sound library. Let's say I've additioned a number of libraries and decided I want to have just one piano from the Boulder Pianos XF library. I already have all of the voices from Granular Voices XF in User Bank 4, and I have 16 voices from the Neo Soul Rhodes library in User Bank 3. I want to load one piano from Boulder Pianos XF to User 3 Bank B number 1, which is also 017. This slot is not occupied by a Neo-Soul Rhodes voice. So I press Voice and File. I make sure that the Boulder Pianos library is on my USB drive. There it is. I make sure that file type is set to Voice by navigating down and making sure that is set to Voice. Scroll back up to highlight the name of the library from which I'm loading, Boulder Pianos XF. I press Enter. If you have just turned on your XF and this is the first time you are doing this, you may experience a lag during which time nothing will appear to happen. Then suddenly you will see your User 1 bank light up and you can see the list of voices in User Bank 1 that are inside the library from which you are loading. This occurs because the XF is documenting what is on the USB drive. So, assuming the User 1 bank button is lit, you will see a list of voices in your screen. These voices are what is in User Bank 1 of this saved library. User Bank 1, User Bank 2, and User Bank 3 are all stock Yamaha sounds from the original factory set. The Boulder piano sounds were stored to User Bank 4. Therefore, I press the User 4 button and I see a list of the Boulder piano sounds. I scroll down to the first voice, which is Yamaha C7 Studio. I right cursor once. I make sure that the type is set to Voice. I make sure that my destination is where I want to go. In this case, I'm going to User 3, voice slot number 017. I cursor over and highlight this field next to Load User, and I'm setting that to Flashboard 1. I will now press Load and then Yes. You will see the message Now Loading on your screen, followed by Installing to the Flash Memory Expansion Module. Wait for a while until the samples are burned onto the flashboard. You will then see the Now Loading screen again, followed by the Completed message. Now press the Voice button to exit the file screen and press User 3, B, and then 1, and there is the Boulder Piano Yamaha C7 voice. You can store any single voice from any library this way, thereby mixing and matching sounds from different libraries. Just follow the instructions I gave for loading the Boulder Piano's voice, but make sure that you change the target location you want to load each voice to. You don't want to keep loading multiple voices to the same slot. I'll demonstrate by loading another piano sound from the Boulder library. I press Voice, then File. I make sure that type is set to Voice. I scroll up and highlight the Boulder Piano's XF library name again. I press Enter. I press the bank button for where the Boulder Pianos are located, which is User 4. And I see the list of Boulder Pianos here. I move down until I come to a voice which I personally like, which is the Yamaha Saloon Tack Piano voice in this library. Right cursor button once. I set my destination. In this case, I already have a Boulder Piano in 017, User Bank 3. So the next open slot I have is 018, User Bank 3. I'm all set to go. I press SF2 Load, and then Yes. And I see that this time, the Boulder Piano voice loaded very, very quickly. What happened? I did not see any of that installing to the Flash Memory Expansion Module message. No waiting for the samples to be burned onto the flashboard. Well, you've just seen one of the new XF loading features in action. The Boulder Piano's voice I just loaded is simply a variation voice that uses samples already loaded to the flashboard. The XF is smart enough to know that the samples are already in there, so it doesn't bother to load them again. It just loads the voice data straight away in record time. Anytime you load a voice that uses samples already loaded to the XF, regardless of whether they're in user RAM or on a flashboard, the XF will just load the voice data. So now I have all the voices from Granular Voices XF in User Bank 4. I have the voices from the Neo-Soul Rhodes library in User Bank 3, voices A1 through A16. And I have two pianos from Boulder Pianos XS in User Bank 3, locations B1 and B2. This is my custom sound library, and I'm going to save it as such so I can then reload it anytime I want. I press File, set my type to All. I press the Save button, which is SF1. I get the naming screen. I press F6 to clear it all, and I enter my name by cursing to the characters I want to enter, and then using the F4 insert button to enter those characters. When I'm done with my name, I'm going to press enter and then yes. The file will be saved. In this case, I saved the whole thing as my data 3. It knows that it's going to be referencing samples on the flashboard 1, and it has saved the entire thing as a 306.3 megabyte file. Recapping this section, to load a single voice from a library, press Voice, press File, set type to Voice, set library from which you want to load, you press Enter, select the bank button which contains the voices which are in that library. In this case, I'm going to User Bank 4, which is where they are. You will see a list of the single voices. You highlight one, any one that you want to load. Right cursor once, select your target destination. In this case, I'm selecting User 3, voice slot 018. Cursor over and then up to make sure that next to Load User, it is set to Flashboard 1 or FL1, or it could be FL2 if you're moving it to Flashboard 2. Press Load, and then Yes. We're going to move now to the issue of loading performances. First and foremost, if you are loading a library that is larger than 128 megabytes or exceeds 128 waveforms, you must load it to a flashboard. DCP Productions Library Complete Orchestra is an example of a library that is large in size and contains performances. Performances, remember, are stacks of individual voices. Each performance contains voices that are in particular voice slots. If you load those voices first to different voice slots in different user banks, and then load the performances won't know you moved the voices that are needed to different locations. So the performances will be wrong. That said, you can load a single performance from any library to any performance location. First, you must choose the right mode. Performance mode, what else, by pressing the Perform button. Next, press the File button. Now scroll down and set the type to Performance. Remember, unless you're in Performance mode, you won't see this file type available. There it is, Performance. Now scroll up and select the library from which you want to load a single performance. In this case, I've saved the XF factory data as a library onto my USB drive. So I'll select that, factory.n3.x3a. Then I press Enter. Now I can see a list of performances in this library. The User 1 bank performances are listed here. If I wanted to see the performances in the other banks, I just press the relevant bank button. I press User 2 and I see the list of performances in User 2. If I press 3, I see the User 3 performances. If I press User 4, I see the User 4 bank performances, and so on. I'll go back to User 1, and I'm going to load this first performance. I'm going to select it by pressing the Increment Yes button, and moving down to the third performance, which is altered states. Then I press the right cursor button once, and I select my target location, which is going to be Performance User Bank 1, 001, and I press SF2 Load. Now, let's review one more thing. As I press this button, SF2 Load, and then Yes, I get a warning message. This performance uses user voices. This means that it is referencing user voices which are in the User 1 bank. You can go ahead and press Enter again, and the performance will load very quickly. To recap, loading single performances. Press the Perform button, which puts you in performance mode. Press File. Scroll and navigate to the name of the library from which you want to load. Press Enter. User 1 will light up, and you can see a list of the performances in the User 1 bank of this library. To see what performances are in the other user banks, simply press the relevant user bank button. For example, User 2 shows you the list of performances in User 2 bank. User 3 shows you the User 3 bank performances, and User 4 shows the User 4 bank performances. Select from the user bank that you want to load from. Press the Increment Yes button to scroll down and select a performance. Then simply select the destination where you want the performance to go. Make sure that your type is set to performance. Press SF2 Load, and Yes. If you see this message, this performance uses user voices. It simply means that it is using voices which are located in the user bank. Go ahead and press Enter, and the performance will load. The next section will deal with loading XS format or ES format sounds to the MOTIF XF. The MOTIF XF, as mentioned earlier, can load MOTIF ES and MOTIF XS format files. There is an important thing to remember. A file saved on a MOTIF ES, for example, as an AW file, will have been saved with the old MOTIF ES voices and performances and song data. Everything that was in the ES will be loaded with that AW file if you load it to the XF. Thus, when you load ES format files to the MOTIF XF, you will wipe out your XF user banks, performances, and voices, and replace them with old MOTIF ES user bank voices and performances. You won't overwrite the XF preset voices. Those can't be erased, but anything that was in your voice user banks or your performance user banks will be erased. It will be gone, and in its place will be old ES sounds. Let's go further than that. The MOTIF ES had only 2 user banks. The MOTIF XS had 3. If you, for example, decide to load an XS library to the MOTIF XF, here is an XS format library. Your user banks 1, 2, and 3 will be loaded with XS sounds, and user 4 will be completely blank. No sounds in it at all. Why? Because in the MOTIF XS, there is no user bank 4. So it was impossible to save a library with anything in user bank 4. My suggestion is to load MOTIF ES or MOTIF XS libraries one voice at a time by doing the following. Press Voice Mode, press File, set type to Voice, navigate back up to and highlight the name of the XS formatted or ES formatted library you want to load from, press Enter, select the user bank within that library from which you want to load a voice. For instance, I'm going to load a voice from MoSchool 2 version 2 XS format. The voices for that library are in user 3, so I've selected the user 3 button, and now here's a list of my sounds in that library, the voices in that library, and I'm going to select the first one, and I'm going to load it to any voice location I really want to. In this example, I will load it to the MOTIF XS user 1 bank and voice location 001. I press load and then yes. And now here it is in user 1A1. Now I have a single voice from an XS library loaded into my XF. Follow this procedure for each voice you want to load from an ES or XS format library. Remember to make sure your target locations are correct so you don't keep loading different voices to the same slot. Once done, you need to save again as an ALL file with a name you prefer. The file will be saved as an XF format file onto your USB drive with a name with a .N2 or .N3 or .N1 and a .X3A in the extension. Reviewing loading ES or XS files to the XF. You can load MOTIF ES and MOTIF XS format files to the XF, but doing so will load old ES or XS voices and performances into your XF. So your best method for doing this is to load the sounds from ES or XS files one at a time as single voices or as single performances. The load procedure for single voices is press voice, press file, set type to voice, scroll up and highlight the name of the library from which you want to load. Press enter. You will see a list in the user bank. So select the user bank from which you want to load. Scroll down to select the voice. Make sure that you now have the target location that you want. And then press SF2 load and yes. Do this for all the voices in the ES or XS format library you want to load. When done with loading all the single voices you want, save the file as a new ALL file by pressing File, set it to All, then press SF1 Save, enter a name for the file you want to save, then press Enter and Yes. In this section, we'll briefly touch on saving files whose samples are all on a flashboard. Let's say you make a few changes to a couple of voices, and the samples for those voices are all on a flashboard. You don't have to save the whole file and its samples again to a USB drive. You can just save the little changes you made to the voice data. Assuming you did your business and changed a couple of voices, press Voice, press File, set type to All. Make sure that the fields next to FL1 and FL2 are set to Without Sample. Save. You'll be asked to make a new name for the file. I'm going to call this file My Data Number 3. Then I press Enter and Yes. And now the file saves very quickly, as you can see, and shows up in my screen now as a very small file, 2.1 megabytes, as opposed to this file, which is also called MyData3, but has a .n2 in the name, meaning that it saved the file with samples, and it is 306 megabytes. Both of these files contain the same voice data, but one of them does not contain any sample data. Now let's say you change your mind and you do want all the samples to be saved with your file onto the USB drive. Press Voice, press File, set type to All, set Save FL1 to With Sample if your samples are on Flashboard 1, and save FL2 to With Sample if your samples are on Flashboard 2. In this case, all my samples are on Flashboard 1, so I have that set to With Sample. I go ahead and I'm going to save it with a name called MyData3. I hit SF1 Save. I come up with the naming screen. I name it, and then I press Enter and Yes. Of course, this will take a much longer time. And remember, you will have to load the file back to the flashboard the next time. You cannot load it to user RAM. So if you were loading to the flashboard, it might be a good idea once again to clear the samples off the flashboard after you have saved this file. Let's review how to do that again. You press Utility, you press F6 Flash, select which flashboard you want to delete from, in this case flashboard 1, FL1, and then select SF2 Delete All. Recapping. If you have a bunch of sounds loaded and their samples are on either of the flashboards and you want to save the whole thing onto a USB drive, press File, then set Type to All, and set Save FL1 to with sample if your samples are on flashboard 1. Save FL2 is set to with sample if your samples are on flashboard 2. You press SF1 Save, make a name for the file, then press Enter and Yes, and wait for it to complete the save. If you have no samples you wish to save with your file, or you just made a few minor changes to voices and want to save just those minor changes, you press File, set Type to All, set Save FL1 field to Without Sample, and FL2 field to Without Sample. Press SF1 Save, name your file, press Enter, and then Yes. To clear your flashboard and start completely over with everything, press Utility, F6, make sure you have the formatted flashboard selected by looking in the upper left-hand corner. You will see the list of samples. You press SF2 Delete All, and wait a long time for the flashboard to be cleared. Do the same thing if you have a second flashboard in FL2. Once done, you press Voice, and then you will want to reset the MOTIF XF to its original factory condition by pressing Utility, then Job, then Enter, then Yes, and you will restore the XF to its original factory condition, and you can proceed with loading the files you want to again. We've explained in great detail exactly how to load sounds and manage sample data in your MOTIF XF. It's a lot of information to remember, and it's impossible to remember it all at one time. If you get lost, simply go back to the video's main menu and select the chapter from the index that you want to review. At the end of each chapter, there is a recap of the information. Thanks for watching, and we hope that we've helped you to keep your XF fully loaded.
Flashboards, or flash memory expansion modules, come in one of two sizes, 512 MB or 1024 MB. The XF has two flashboard slots, and you can install whatever you like, wherever you like. One 512 MB board in slot 1 and a 1024 MB board in slot 2, or a pair of 1024 MB boards in both. It's up to you. And the installation and formatting process is the same no matter which boards you install where. Here's what you do. First, turn off your MOTIF XF and take the power cord out. Now unscrew the back plate, hold the flashboard carefully, try not to touch anything on the circuit board. Line up the screws with the socket and insert the board. Make sure the board is fully seated, then tighten up the screws, then replace the cover. Once you power up, you'll see this screen. Now you need to format the flashboard. Go to Utility and press F6. Select which slot your flashboard is in, and then press SF3 to format.